When the war ended, a strange silence fell over the Pacific. The ocean, once a stage for thunder and fire, was now quiet, and across its endless blue, ships carried men who had surrendered everything. Among them were the defeated soldiers of the Empire of Japan. These men had been taught since birth that surrender was worse than death, that capture was the deepest dishonor imaginable. Yet here they were, thousands of them, transported by their enemies not to execution, but to a new, uncertain existence. They were raised on the ideal of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of the Japanese soul, an unbreakable faith in their emperor and their nation. To die was to serve. To surrender was to become a living ghost. But the Americans who took them prisoner did something entirely unexpected. They refused to treat them as ghosts. The first major captures happened after the brutal battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. For months, Japanese soldiers had fought to the death, even when all hope was lost. On Saipan, entire families jumped from cliffs rather than face capture. This wasn't madness, it was doctrine, engraved into them since childhood. But as the war dragged on, hunger, exhaustion, and the undeniable reality of defeat began to erode this ironclad resolve. Men too weak to fight started laying down their arms. They were stunned and silent as they were marched to prison camps. One former sergeant, Kenji Yamashita, later recalled, "When they gave us water, I could not drink. I thought perhaps it was poison. Then I saw them drink from the same canteen. My hands trembled. The world I believed in began to crack." In those first weeks, American soldiers were just as uncertain. They'd been told the Japanese were fanatics who would never surrender. But these prisoners looked thin, frightened, and utterly human. They bowed when spoken to. They thanked their guards for rice. They wept over letters from home. The Americans, baffled, began to see something no propaganda had prepared them for. The enemy was a man. By 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners were scattered across camps from Guam to Hawaii, and eventually to the mainland United States. The largest operations were in places like Fort McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp McAllister in Oklahoma. But it all started in the tropical camps, the first laboratories of this profound cultural collision. Surprisingly, the camps were humane. The Geneva Convention was followed and often exceeded. Prisoners received food, sometimes better than what civilians back in Japan had, medical care, and even education. To the prisoners, this wasn't just kindness, it was deeply confusing. "If they are monsters," one wrote in his diary, "why do they treat us like men?" That question planted the first seed of transformation. In 1944, the US government launched an experimental program called the Prisoner Reorientation Project. The goal wasn't just to manage prisoners, but to subtly introduce the idea of a different Japan, one that could exist without a divine emperor at its core. The program started with lectures on democracy, films showing American life, and books like The Grapes of Wrath, translated into Japanese. The guards were instructed to never humiliate the prisoners or mock the emperor. "We will not defeat them with force," one officer wrote, "but with the weight of their own doubts." The first film screenings were met with polite silence. The prisoners watched American families sitting around dinner tables, women speaking freely, and rooms filled with ordinary laughter. It was everything they'd been taught to fight against. But something stirred. "They live without fear," noted one prisoner. "Their women are not silent, their leaders are not gods, and still their nation is strong." Slowly, the re-education officers noticed changes. Men began volunteering for chores, teaching each other English, and even forming small orchestras with makeshift instruments. In the evenings, the faint sounds of harmonicas and Japanese folk songs mixed with American tunes, a strange, beautiful duet born from defeat. In the spring of 1945, some prisoners were moved to the mainland United States. For most, it was their first glimpse of America. They expected hatred, But instead, they saw gleaming cities, families in cars, and shops full of goods. Everything contradicted the propaganda they'd been fed. "They told us America was chaos," recalled Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, "but it was order. They told us it was empty, but it was full of life." At a camp in Wisconsin, prisoners worked in fields alongside American farmers. The work was hard, but fair. Some farmers even invited prisoners to dinner. They sat at tables with the families of men who had died fighting them. In these awkward, peaceful meals, a silent recognition of mutual humanity began to grow. The walls of ideology started to crumble. Of course, not everyone embraced this change. Many clung desperately to the emperor's name, whispering prayers at dawn. They saw those who adapted as traitors. One prisoner carved into his barracks wall, "Better a loyal ghost than a living dog." But even the most resistant felt the tremors of doubt. The war had promised immortality through death, but now, in captivity, they discovered that life went on, and kindness could exist outside their imperial myth. It wasn't the lectures or the propaganda that broke the spell. It was the quiet, relentless persistence of human decency. Then, on August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's voice crackled across the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The camps fell into a stunned silence. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others knelt and wept. For the first time, they heard their God speak not in command, but in sorrow. His voice was humble, human, frail. In that moment, they understood the world they knew was gone forever. The American officers were cautious, fearing psychological collapse, but instead, a kind of collective relief swept through the camps. "We were free," remembered Yamashita, "not from the Americans, but from the fear that ruled us." The men began to debate among themselves, about democracy, about the emperor, about what it meant to be Japanese now. Repatriation began in late 1946. The ships that carried them home were quiet. Each man was returning to a Japan that no longer existed. Its cities were ash, its people haunted. They weren't greeted as heroes. Many were shunned. Their families hid the shame of their captivity. In the eyes of their countrymen, they had failed. And yet, these men carried something invisible back with them, a new understanding of humanity. Some became teachers, writers, and pacifists. Kenji Yamashita opened a small school in Kyoto. He taught English, but also ethics. On the first day of class, he wrote a single sentence on the blackboard: "True strength is not in dying for your beliefs, but in changing them when they are wrong." He had learned that not from a book, but from an American prison camp. Historians still debate the morality of the re-education program. Was it benevolent or just a clever form of manipulation? The truth is likely somewhere in between. But what is undeniable is that the experience transformed thousands of men, not through violence, but through the quiet power of decency and contradiction. As one American officer wrote in his journal, "We discovered that the Japanese are not incapable of reason, only starved of it. They are men who were told that mercy was weakness. We showed them that mercy is another form of strength." Thank you for watching. This story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, bridges of understanding can be built. If you found this story as moving as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories. We'll see you next time. History often remembers wars for their epic battles, the grand strategies, and the names of generals. But sometimes the most profound victories aren't won on the battlefield at all. They happen in the quiet moments that follow, in places history books rarely mention. Imagine this, a quiet revolution unfolding not in the headlines, but in classrooms built from bamboo and in barracks filled with passionate debate. This was the reality for many Japanese prisoners of war in America after World War II. It was here, in these unlikely settings, that the slow thawing of hearts began. Shy smiles were exchanged over shared cigarettes, and conversations planted the seeds of a future alliance. Decades later, as the United States and Japan forged one of the strongest partnerships in the world, few remembered where it all started. Some of the very men who had fought fiercely on islands like Iwo Jima would later send their own children to study at American universities. Others would revisit the sites of their captivity, not with bitterness, but with a surprising sense of gratitude. At a reunion in Hawaii in 1971, a beautiful moment captured this spirit. A former POW named Hiroshi Tanaka met one of his old guards. They shared an awkward but heartfelt embrace. "You taught me," Tanaka said, his voice thick with emotion, "that kindness can be more powerful than any army." The old guard smiled, replying, "And you taught us that our enemies were human." This isn't a story about the humiliation of defeat. It's a story of rediscovery. Faced with a world that shattered their certainties, these men were forced to rebuild themselves from the inside out. And the Americans, for all their power, learned a crucial lesson too. Victory is incomplete until it begins to heal what it has broken. The most lasting triumphs often occur in the quiet spaces where hatred dissolves, and we remember the fragile humanity we all share. When Kenji Yamashita, a former prisoner and later a teacher, passed away in 1983, his students honored him with a simple wooden tablet. On it, they engraved his favorite words, a blend of two traditions. From the silence of surrender comes the beginning of wisdom. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the deeper truths of our shared history. We'll see you in the next one. The ships that brought them home carried no flags. There were no brass bands, no parades, no crowds waiting on the docks, only the smell of salt, diesel, and ash, and the heavy, almost sacred silence of men returning to a country they no longer recognized. Japan in 1946 was not a nation but a wound. Cities had become skeletons of wood and shadow. For the returning prisoners of war, it was a second kind of captivity, not in the hands of the enemy, but in the gaze of their own people. When the former POWs stepped off the ships, many were met with stares of disgust or pity. To surrender had been the unforgivable sin. To survive was an accusation. Families whispered behind closed doors. Kenji Yamashita, once a sergeant in the Imperial Army, wrote in his notebook, "They looked at us as if we carried a disease. Perhaps we did, the disease of doubt." But he also noticed something else. The children, who had grown up amid rubble, no longer bowed to portraits of the emperor with the same trembling reverence. The voice that had once been divine had spoken in surrender. The spell was broken. The American occupation that followed was both humiliating and miraculous. General MacArthur's headquarters issued decrees that seemed unimaginable just months earlier. The emperor renounced his divinity, women were granted the vote, schools began teaching not obedience, but individuality. To the old generation, this was desecration. To the younger, it was revelation. And in between stood the former prisoners, men who had already crossed this threshold of disillusionment in the quiet laboratories of captivity. They had seen America not as an abstract enemy, but as a functioning society, imperfect yet alive. It was these men, unnoticed, often distrusted, who became silent translators of two worlds. They knew how Americans thought, how they organized, how they spoke. They also understood the soul of Japan, its pride, its shame, its hunger for meaning after catastrophe. When occupation officials sought interpreters, teachers, and advisors, many of the first volunteers were former POWs. Their voices carried a strange authority, born of defeat but tempered by understanding. An American officer described them as men who learned democracy not from textbooks, but from mercy. In 1947, Kenji Yamashita, opened a modest school in Kyoto. The building had no roof tiles, only corrugated metal sheets salvaged from a factory. Yet inside, he built something more enduring than walls, a space for questioning. He began each class not with a lecture, but with a story. He spoke of the first time he had seen American guards share food with prisoners. "We were told mercy was weakness," he told them, "but I saw it feed men stronger than fear ever could." His lessons mixed Western philosophy and Japanese proverbs. He quoted Emerson and Basho in the same breath, and when asked why he no longer bowed to the emperor's portrait, he smiled and said, "Because I have learned to bow to truth instead." Across Japan, similar awakenings began to ripple quietly. Former soldiers found new ways to express their experiences. The poet Shigeo Arai, once a naval officer, published a small collection titled "Under the Enemy's Sky." His verses spoke not of hatred but of human recognition. "He gave me water from his hand, and I saw my reflection in his palm." The book sold only a few hundred copies, but it circulated in universities, read in whispers by students hungry for a different kind of patriotism, one rooted in self-knowledge rather than conquest. In Tokyo, a group of former POWs founded a society called Kokoro no Kai, the Circle of the Heart. Their unofficial motto was, "To understand the enemy is the beginning of peace." Not everyone embraced this transformation. Nationalists accused the returnees of being Americanized, of betraying the spirit of Japan. They were mocked as Heisenjin, men of defeat. But these accusations only proved the depth of the change underway. For centuries, Japan had defined virtue as obedience. Now, quietly, through the disillusioned voices of its defeated sons, a new virtue was emerging: reflection. In one heated public forum, a young man accused a former POW lecturer of teaching submission. The old soldier replied calmly, "No, I am teaching survival. Submission is silence. Survival is to speak after silence." The audience fell quiet, understanding for the first time that to live beyond shame might itself be a form of courage. By the time the American occupation formally ended in 1952, Japan was already transforming faster than anyone could have imagined. Within this new landscape moved the quiet influence of those who had once been prisoners. They became teachers, advisors, and journalists, their lives unglamorous, but their impact profound. They were living evidence that defeat could educate as deeply as victory. Yamashita's school in Kyoto became known as the School of the Captured Teacher. One of his students, decades later, would say, "We learned that freedom does not begin in governments, but in the minds of those who question what they were told to obey." In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of the war's end, Yamashita was invited to a Tokyo radio program. The host asked what he had learned from his time as a prisoner. He paused, then said, "That victory and defeat are illusions. What matters is who you become when both are gone." Listeners across the country were moved, and in that act of listening, something shifted, a collective willingness to confront what had once been unspeakable. In the years that followed, contact between former enemies deepened. In 1960, an American officer who had been at his camp met with Yamashita in Kyoto. They shared tea and memories. The officer asked if he had ever forgiven the war. Yamashita smiled. "Forgiveness is a strange word. It suggests power. I prefer understanding. Forgiveness ends a story. Understanding allows it to continue." By the 1960s, Japan had re-emerged, its new pacifist constitution and humanist education system tangled with the lessons of captivity. The Japanese word hansei, reflection, became a cultural ideal. In its quiet syllables lived the legacy of men who had been forced to confront themselves in defeat. Yamashita's students carried his teachings into universities and diplomatic corps, advocating for peace and reconciliation. They embodied his greatest lesson, that empathy could be inherited. Kenji Yamashita passed away in 1983. On his desk was an unfinished manuscript. It began with a single line: "Every nation must one day learn to lose, for only then can it learn to see." His students published it posthumously. In its final pages, Yamashita wrote, "I used to think that to love one's country was to defend it from change. Now I believe it is to keep it worthy of change. The war taught us to die for ideals. The peace taught us to live without them, and then to rebuild them from truth. Today, few remember the names of those camps, but their echoes endure. The legacy of those prisoners is not one of shame, but of transformation. They faced the collapse of everything they were told to believe, and emerged with something greater: the capacity to think freely." In a museum in Hiroshima, a photograph hangs quietly on a wall. Japanese prisoners in an American camp, smiling as they play baseball with their guards. The caption reads simply, "After war, there is life." Perhaps that is the true victory, not in conquest or surrender, but in the rediscovery of shared humanity after the storm has passed. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories that explore the hidden corners of our shared history.